In several states across the country, Democrats are petitioning the courts to strike former President Trump from the ballot, arguing that Trump somehow engaged in an insurrection and thus, according to the 14th Amendment, cannot serve as president, even though there was no insurrection, and even though President Trump didn't do anything that could possibly be considered as engaging in anything remotely resembling an insurrection. On Thursday, one of these cases was up for oral argument before the Minnesota Supreme Court. I'll tell you everything you need to know about the arguments. Then, in our deep dive segment, I'll take a close look at the seminal importance of Israel as the most important ally of the United States. Biden's weak response to the atrocities committed by Hamas is encouraging further terror. The United States needs Israel. It's time for us to provide them with the real support in the war against Hamas that they need. And that is a war, by the way, to preserve not just Israel, but all of Western civilization. All that, plus behind the headlines on this week's episode of Founding Principles. As always, I'm your host, Doug Wardlow.
A battle for the fate of America rages. The radical left seeks to destroy the very foundations of our republic. God, the family, and the Constitution are under attack. Amidst the chaos, Doug Wardlow speaks truth and points the way back to freedom. It is time to go on offense. This is Founding Principles with Doug Wardlow.
On Thursday, the Minnesota Supreme Court heard oral arguments on the petition of a group of voters who are seeking to have President Trump declared ineligible to be on the primary election ballot in Minnesota. Now, it's pretty much impossible to determine the likely outcome of a case that's up for oral argument by trying to read between the lines of questions that the justices ask the attorneys who are arguing before them. That said, based on the questions the justices were asking on Thursday, and keep in mind that most of the 5 justices who heard the case were appointed by Democrats, there seemed to be a great deal of skepticism regarding the arguments being made by petitioners. So, there is cause for optimism that Minnesota's High Court will come down on the side of respondents Donald Trump, the Trump campaign, and the Republican Party. If the Minnesota Supreme Court were to go the other way and order an evidentiary hearing, the outcome of which would determine Trump's eligibility to be on the ballot, it's likely that the ruling will wind up at the U.S. Supreme Court. And I'm confident that the nation's top court will ultimately rule that these challenges to Trump's eligibility to serve as president have no merit whatsoever, shutting down all the petitions being brought forward in various states. But let's take a closer look at the arguments being made by the Minnesota petitioners seeking to block Trump's access to the ballot. The arguments are terrible and ridiculous. In the Minnesota case, which is entitled Groh versus Simon, Steve Simon being Minnesota's Democrat Secretary of State in charge of elections, the petitioners are asking the Minnesota Supreme Court to order an evidentiary hearing where the court, presumably through an appointed referee, would take evidence and make a determination about whether President Trump is ineligible to hold office under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Section 3 states that no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. Basically, the petitioners here in Minnesota, like similar petitioners in other states, are arguing that President Trump, when he was president, engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States and thus may not appear on the ballot for President of the United States. On the merits, this is a ridiculous claim. First, there was no insurrection or rebellion against the United States. The people pushing these claims to bar President Trump from the ballot argue that the January 6th riots at the Capitol constitute an insurrection. As the lawyer for the Trump campaign pointed out at the oral argument here in Minnesota on Thursday, however, it's important to keep in mind that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment didn't just come out of nowhere. It was a product of the Civil War, passed after the Civil War during the period of time when the country was trying to piece itself back together. That's the appropriate context necessary to understand what the framers of the 14th Amendment meant when they used the words insurrection or rebellion. As the attorney for Trump put it, the touchstone for understanding the phrase insurrection or rebellion in the 14th Amendment is the Civil War, and the phrase thus means some sort of organized form of warfare or violence oriented towards breaking away from or overthrowing the government of the United States. It is clear from a plethora of publicly available sources, of which the Minnesota High Court can take judicial notice, that the January 6th riots were not organized violence, and certainly they were not organized warfare. And they were not at all oriented towards breaking away from the United States or overthrowing the government of the United States. So on the merits of the question of whether President Trump is ineligible under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, the answer is no, he is certainly not ineligible, because there was no insurrection or rebellion in which President Trump could have engaged in. But even assuming for the sake of argument only that the January 6th riots did constitute an insurrection, which they certainly did not, the petitioners would still have to establish that President Trump actually did something that would be considered engaging in insurrection. But as is widely known, according to publicly available sources, President Trump did not encourage the January 6th riots. On the contrary, he publicly urged the rioters to go home now. President Trump did absolutely nothing that could be considered engaging in an insurrection. And the January 6th riots were not an insurrection in the first place. Petitioners might want to point to the article of impeachment under which President Trump was impeached for engaging in an insurrection. But if they want to point to the House's article of impeachment, then they also need to admit that President Trump was acquitted on that count of the impeachment by the trier of fact in the process of impeachment and removal, that is, the United States Senate. You know, the House impeaches, which is akin to a prosecutor filing charges or a grand jury issuing an indictment. But the Senate determines whether an impeachment article is actually true and justifies removal from office, much like a jury determines whether a defendant is guilty of a criminal charge. So the Senate, in the impeachment of Trump, acquitted Trump on the charge of insurrection. Well, that's very good evidence that Trump absolutely did not engage in an insurrection, settling the question of the merits of the petitioner's claim under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. But you see, the Minnesota Supreme Court doesn't need to reach the merits of the question. The petitioners in the Minnesota case are asking for an evidentiary hearing where a determination about engaging in an insurrection would be made. But it's clear that that isn't even warranted. As the lawyers for Trump and the Republican Party argued, the question of whether to render a candidate ineligible for the ballot is a political question that shouldn't be decided by a court at all. Now, the political question doctrine is a judicial doctrine that basically says that a court won't decide a constitutional question when it's about a matter that should be resolved through the political process. In brief, courts usually find a matter to be a political question and thus won't decide that question in one of two scenarios. First, a matter may constitute a political question if the matter implicates the separation of powers, where the Constitution commits the matter to a branch of government other than the judiciary. Second, a matter can be found to be a political question based on other prudential concerns that lead the court to choose to refrain from adjudicating the matter. That might be the case, for example, if deciding the matter would not be possible without rendering a policy judgment, which the courts won't do. As the lawyer for the Trump campaign argued on Thursday before the Minnesota Supreme Court, there is no more political question than who should be president. For that reason, when parties go to a court and ask the courts to step into the process of determining who should be president, overwhelmingly, courts have said that they won't do it, that the decision shouldn't be made by the judiciary because it's a non-justiciable political question. Simply put, state courts should not be involved in the business of determining whether a person can run for president. What's more, we're talking about a primary election here. In a primary election, as the attorney for the Republican Party pointed out on Thursday, the political parties are trying to determine who their standard bearer will be. Well, that implicates the First Amendment's protection of freedom of association. Giving a state court the power to strike a presidential candidate from a primary ballot unduly burdens the political party's associational freedom. That in and of itself is a good argument that justifies denial of the petition to bar Trump from the ballot. But there's yet another very good argument. Namely, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is not self-executing. That is, there needs to be legislation passed to give effect to the insurrection or rebellion clause. Consider that Section 5 of the 14th Amendment states that Congress has the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of the 14th Amendment, and that includes Section 3. So the Constitution basically commits the enforcement of the insurrection or rebellion clause to Congress. That indicates that Section 3 is not self-executing. Congress has never passed a law stating what an insurrection is for the purposes of the 14th Amendment, and there's no controlling legal precedent on that question either. This separates the insurrection and rebellion disqualification provision, by the way, from the self-executing provisions of, say, Article 2, which set out the minimum standards for the presidency, namely the minimum age requirement and the requirement to be a natural-born citizen. Everyone knows what those things mean, but Congress never passed any legislation telling us what an insurrection is. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, therefore, can't be self-executing. And if the courts try to figure out for themselves what insurrection means, well, then they risk making a policy judgment on a matter committed by the Constitution to Congress. And that means the court would be ruling on a political question. One more important point. It's pretty clear that Congress did not intend for a state court to be able to use Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to determine that a candidate shouldn't be on the ballot for president. Think about it. The 14th Amendment is a product of the Civil War. Why would Congress say that an office holder is barred from holding office for engaging in an insurrection and then hand the question of whether a person is barred due to engaging in an insurrection over to the states who had just engaged in a rebellion and insurrection? Congress couldn't have intended that. It would make no sense. So the arguments against the petitioners seeking to strike President Trump from the ballot are very strong. I'm optimistic that the Minnesota Supreme Court will ultimately rule against the petitioners. And even if they don't, I believe the U.S. Supreme Court will ultimately rule that these challenges have no merit. So given how weak the legal arguments are, why are Democrats and Democrat-aligned groups bringing these challenges in various places around the country? Well, it's all political. They want the headlines that these cases generate. And I'm sure they've also calculated that bringing forward these challenges forces the Trump campaign and the Republican Party to divert significant resources to battle the challenges. Those are resources that could be spent on traditional campaign activities. So it seems to me that these challenges aren't really meant to strike Trump from the ballot. They're intended to push a narrative, drain Trump campaign resources, and distract from Biden's dismal record. But rest assured, Trump will ultimately be on the ballot. There was no insurrection, and the 14th Amendment wasn't meant to be used as a political cudgel to stop Americans from voting for a particular candidate. And now it's time for Behind the Headlines. Well, if you like the content that we're providing, please go ahead and support the show by going to our sponsor, mypillow.com, and you can use the promo code WARDLOW there, WARDLOW, to get discounts on lots of their wonderful products. mypillow.com, promo code WARDLOW, WARDLOW. All right, time for Behind the Headlines. First up today, Virginia has a very important election coming up on Tuesday that will determine which party controls the Virginia House and the Virginia Senate. Like many states, interest groups on both sides are pouring in money trying to get their voters to the polls. Some early reports on the early voting numbers spell trouble for the Democrats, or at least they could. The numbers are down significantly in terms of early voting from 2021 when Republican Glenn Youngkin won the governorship. That's very good news for Republicans, and our thoughts, our prayers are with the Republicans on the ground working to get our voters to the polls. Republicans tend to favor in-person election day voting, so we can presume that the low early vote numbers are real trouble for the Democrats. However, if Republicans fail to win a majority in either chamber, well, we can point out one very damaging cause. In general, our messaging on life hasn't been great. Democrats, they're very good at messaging. In part, this is a result from of them being more unified on policy and just kind of lockstep on everything. It's also because they seem to understand politics in some certain situations and messaging better than our side does. And let me explain that comment. So here in Minnesota, in the last election, our Republican Party, state Republican Party, sent out a memo to all of our statewide candidates telling them not to talk about abortion at all. And if asked about it, to say that abortion is a constitutional right in Minnesota and that the legislature really can't do anything about it, so to stop talking about it. It's not an issue. Well, that was just terrible advice, an absurd and ridiculous thing to tell our candidates to do. Because what did that do? Well, it allowed the Democrats to control the narrative on the abortion issue. If you run from an issue like that, it signals that you don't actually believe in what you're saying. It makes the candidates that are saying those things appear to be wishy-washy. It makes their positions appear to be indefensible, even though they're not. You can't retreat on an important issue like that and then hope to win over independents or moderates, because they'll just view you as someone who can't lead and someone who is not genuine and not authentic. And that's the worst thing for a political candidate to be. So Republicans shot themselves in the foot by not standing up for life, and that was terrible advice. And I hope that's not happening in Virginia. Life is such a fundamentally important issue. Of course, life is precious from conception until natural death. So what we need to do is combat the leftist narrative by talking about how truly radical their side is on the issue. Instead of running from the issue, let's fight back hard. Let's fight back hard on it, win hearts and minds. Let's take a stand and put out the right messaging. Show how the Democrats are incredibly extreme on it. Show how they want to have abortion right up to the moment of birth. Right? And in Minnesota, we used to have something called the Infant Born Alive Protection Act. Well, Minnesota's now the only state where that has been repealed. So now, if a baby is born alive after a botched abortion, there's no criminal penalty if the doctor doesn't provide life-saving treatments, which is basically murder. It's terrible. It's a horrible thing. And that's a result of Minnesota Republicans running terrible races last time around and losing control of everything, from the governorship to the Attorney General's office to the state Senate. Just terrible result. We need to stand tall on these important issues, stand up for what we know is right. And when we do that, then we can be convincing and we can win on these issues, because Americans do not like the Democrats' extreme abortion up to the moment of birth position. So one election at a time, one person at a time, let's go ahead and win this issue and win elections. Second up today, Vice President Harris announced the first ever national strategy to combat Islamophobia. Oh, finally, I know we're all waiting for this. If you're worried about feeding your family or educating your children, an increasingly unstable environment, or global environment rather, have no fear. The White House is combating Islamophobia. Right. Never mind the virulent and hateful and disgusting anti-Semitism on display at college campuses across America, where protesters and even some professors are lining up to praise Hamas for committing atrocities in Israel, slaughtering Jews and even decapitating babies. Now, never mind about that. That's not a real problem. The real problem is Islamophobia? It's absurd and terrible. Now, obviously, this administration runs this country like some kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion office on some college campus because their voters demand it. The move is bizarre even for them. It seems like an Saturday Night Live skit or something. Someone typed in, what is something a generic Democrat leftist administration would do to pander to voters, and the AI generator just popped out, let's have a campaign against Islamophobia. But I think this reveals their true concerns about the Islamic extremist violent voters in their base in certain states. There's a reason why Biden showed up in Minnesota this week. This new initiative also highlights another really troubling thing about this administration. They pat themselves on the back all the time. That's all they ever do, even though they accomplish nothing. Biden has been running ads, or some PAC perhaps that supports him has been running ads at least, touting his ability to get bills passed like no other president. Really? Well, whatever bills he's getting passed, they're nothing burgers. Remember when he was pressed on rising gas prices and he was asked about walking back President Trump's work to make us energy independent? Well, his answer was truly remarkable. He said that he has approved thousands of drilling permits for oil companies, and it's up to them to start drilling. Well, this was incredible news. Why would these companies not be willing to drill if this was true? Well, here's why. Because he approved drilling permits in areas where there was nothing to drill. There's no oil there. So yes, technically, Joe Biden did approve thousands of new drilling permits, but he did so knowing that all this would do is allow him to pretend like he's pro-energy when he's actually not. Sleepy Joe is a good nickname, but Do-Nothing Joe might be more fitting. The left will continue to race bait and virtue signal, but it's important for us to continue to call them out when they're doing stupid nonsense like this. Third and finally, for Behind the Headlines, the Babylon Bee pointed out something recently that maybe some of you have noticed. The Texas Rangers, who won the World Series, were the only baseball team that didn't hold a Pride Night. Now, this is fantastic, and maybe good things happen to good teams. Who knows? The politicization of sports has been a tragic consequence of living in a post-2015 world. Sports are supposed to be a display of excellence and entertainment for the fans. Instead, the left has tried to turn sports into ritualistic displays for their pagan religion. Some groups, like that one awful pride drag group making fun of Catholics, all but demanded a chance to show themselves at the Los Angeles Dodgers Stadium this year, because it would be a shame if baseball fans didn't get to see a pride drag show before the game, right? It's just ridiculous, terrible, horrible. Unfortunately, many in sports leadership have adopted the pride agenda and incorporated it into merchandise, fan nights, and more. But the Texas Rangers and other professional sports teams are slowly moving away from all this nonsense. Turns out that most fans aren't blue-haired feminists and don't like leftist garbage shoved down their throats. The NHL has been the most resistant to bowing to the LGBT community, sparking outrage amongst the Reddit crowd. So good for the Texas Rangers. I wish the Minnesota Twins would follow suit, but unfortunately Minneapolis is not too far behind, say, Portland or maybe San Francisco for being the craziest city in the United States. Here's to the pursuit of excellence and nothing less. May our nation collectively prioritize greatness once again. The Israeli ground offensive is now well underway. IDF tanks and troops have plunged deep into the Gaza Strip, and their air force is striking tunnel networks and Hamas headquarters, the most important of which is located underneath the largest hospital in Gaza. Hamas is being destroyed. Israel is leading a critical battle against the Islamist terrorist foes of Western civilization. And the United States, the supposed leader of the free world, is sitting on the sidelines watching. That needs to change. Israel is our only real ally in the Middle East. We need to stand by them with more than just words. Their survival is linked to our own. Yes, we sent 2 measly F-16s to bomb an ammunition depot used by one of the many Iranian proxy terror groups, but even that was unoccupied. There were no enemy casualties, and we don't really know what was in that warehouse. That response wasn't enough. The only message it sent was that you can kill American citizens and get away with it. For all his talk about supporting Israel, President Biden has been more concerned about making sure he doesn't lose the support of radical Muslim voters in certain U.S. states than he has been about stopping terror and standing up to evil. Aid to Israel and presence in the region are good, but they're not enough. President Biden seems to think that not stopping Israel, not standing in their way too much, is the same as actively helping them. Last week, he said that, quote, "We're not drawing red lines for Israel." He went on to say his discussions with Israel included the goals of its operations, the importance of protecting Gazan civilians, the safe return of Israeli hostages, and the need to consider what comes next after Hamas is destroyed. I guess he skipped the part about actually destroying Hamas. At least he hasn't called for a ceasefire. That would be a major victory for the terrorists, who could then consolidate and begin planning their next strike. It's hard to plan anything when Israeli tanks and troops are rooting you out of your holes and killing you. Oh, wait. Biden didn't call for a ceasefire, but he did call for a humanitarian pause, which would basically have the same effect. Rather than help Israel destroy Hamas, Biden has our esteemed national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, running around on Sunday news shows making what look like idle threats. On CBS's Face the Nation last Sunday, Sullivan said that we would retaliate again if any of the Iranian proxy terror groups made any more attacks on U.S. forces in the Middle East. Guess what? They have already made more attacks, and surprise, no response from us. It's terrible. Our people, including the Pentagon, are even saying that our lone strike against an Iranian proxy group was in direct response to attacks on U.S. troops and was not connected in any way to the terror attack on Israel or the Israeli response. They've said that repeatedly now. So we are going out of our way to ensure the world knows we are not responding to the dastardly terror attack on one of our closest allies. We want to let all our enemies know that we will not respond to killing American citizens. And we want to make it known that we are not going to get involved in destroying pure evil, a pure evil that harkens to the Holocaust, a comparison Joe Biden himself made. It's insane. It's terrible. It's crazy. But as reported by Politico and others, senior administration officials, granted anonymity, of course, are saying that everything we are doing is designed to deter and prevent an escalation, and that President Biden and his team are busy preparing for all contingencies. Deter? We are not deterring anything with our pathetic response. That is beyond clear. Deterrence involves, imposing a real cost on your enemy, and that cost must outweigh any possible benefit of their, in this case, purely evil intention. The United States has done no such thing. We have done the opposite. We have ensured that our enemies know there is really no cost imposed by the United States for murdering thousands of Israelis, 33 Americans, and taking hundreds of hostages, including Americans. So our anemic response is encouraging more attacks, more hostage taking. That's what it encourages. The only people deterring anything are the Israelis, and we aren't helping them, which detracts their ability to deter further terror as well. That contingency Biden and his clueless team are preparing for, due to the Biden administration's weak response, could be something truly terrible, like an attack on American soil or a larger regional war in the Middle East, one that our weakened military is not prepared for, or both. Just listen to Iran, the financier of all this terror and death. On Saturday, Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi posted on X that Israel's offensive in Gaza has, quote, crossed red lines which may force everyone to take action. The post was in English, which is rare for the Iranians. Now, does that sound like a nation that is being deterred? No, it does not. As I said, the opposite is what is happening. Right now, we have around 900 troops in Syria and around 2,500 troops in neighboring Iraq. They have been attacked 23 times by drones and rockets in the last 2 weeks, some of the attacks coming after our single, small, and pointless retaliatory airstrike. Iran is growing more aggressive, not less. And this is because they do not fear or respect one feeble old man named Joe Biden. Iran is threatening Israel. Iran is threatening us. And this is all on the heels of the deadliest terror attack on this side of 9/11. Now, we know, and we always did know, even though Biden tried to say there was no evidence, that the Iranians were deeply involved in planning, financing, and executing that October 7th dastardly terror attack on Israel. In truth, it was much more than a terror attack. It was an opening salvo in a real attempt to utterly destroy Israel, to create Palestine from the river to the sea, as the terrible pro-Hamas anti-Semitic protesters are shouting all over our own college campuses. We cannot allow that to happen. We must stand by Israel, fight off those who seek its destruction, and ensure that the only free republic in the Middle East stays that way. Have you ever heard the term Shatterbelt? Well, Shatterbelts are, according to foreign policy experts, regions of cultural diversity and political instability with weak states, local rivalries, geostrategic importance, vital natural resources, and international interference. There are many of these, quote, Shatterbelts in the world, but most agree the Middle East is the most important one, and Israel is smack dab in the center of it. What would happen if a hostile power came to hold that area of the world? How much trade flows through the Suez Canal, the Straits of Hormuz? How much oil lies within the region? How much power would a unified Islamic extremist entity have? All that Muslim extremist, Islamic extremist fervor, all the hate and desire to kill, those unpleasantries are not confined to Hamas, ISIS, and the other terror groups. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, each spend billions fostering Wahhabism, a radical sect of Islam that feeds terror. In addition, outside of Israel, there are exactly 0 places in the Middle East where true freedom exists. Monarchs and dictators have the only say over what happens to their people there. They can imprison, torture, or kill anyone they want, at any time and for any reason, and they do. And this includes the Palestinian Authority, who hasn't had elections since 2006. And Hamas, the terror group, won the elections in Gaza. This combination of absolute authoritarianism, radical Islamist extremist fervor, lust, natural resources, and strategic and economic importance is a dangerous combination. The point is that we cannot let the region go the way of Afghanistan, no matter how many Shia, Sunni, or tribal rivalries exist to keep power scattered. We cannot allow the Middle East to become a sanctuary for those who state openly their goal of destroying Israel, killing Jews, eliminating the great Satan that is America, and establishing a Sharia law-based caliphate that destroys individual liberty and has no respect at all for human life. That cannot happen. We must have a real presence in that troubled part of the world. So, enter Israel. They are a beacon of light in a dark and foreboding land. And that is why Israel's existence has been challenged from the very start, even after the Nazis tried to do to the Jews what the Hamas Nazis still want to do. Keep that in mind. There was a Holocaust. Over 6 million Jews dead, gassed, burned in ovens, almost wiped out entirely. It seems like people are forgetting this. Even after all of that, the whole of the Middle East could not and would not accept the Jewish presence in their ancestral homeland. That is the level of evil hatred that Hamas and many others in the Middle East harbor towards the Jews. Back in February of 1947, the British expressed their intention to discontinue their mandated governance in the Middle East. After World War I, you see, the Ottoman Empire, in the process of crumbling, ceded Transjordan and lands covering Israel. The League of Nations stepped in and agreed upon a British mandate for administration of the territory, starting with military government in 1918 and civil administration by 1920. In the aftermath of the 1947 British decision, the UN General Assembly appointed a special committee called the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine to recommend a course of action. They recommended establishing two separate states in the region, one Jewish and one Arab, to be joined economically with Jerusalem under international administration. On November 29, 1947, the United Nations General Assembly voted. The plan was adopted 33 votes to 13 with 10 abstentions. The Jewish side wholly supported and accepted the two-state plan. The Arabs, they rejected it out of hand. By May of 1948, there were about 600,000 Jews in the territory, many of them searching for a home in the wake of the Holocaust. On May 14, 1948, they declared the State of Israel, in accordance with the UN plan, and on their ancestral homeland, lands where Jews have lived for around 4,000 years. Jewish presence in Israel goes back to the period of the biblical patriarchs, around 1900 BC. They were known as the Israelites, of course. Their capital, Jerusalem, has been destroyed 17 times and rebuilt 18 times. Everyone, from the Egyptians, Babylonians, Greeks, Persians, Romans, Byzantines, Arabs, Crusaders, Ottomans, and others, have subjugated the Jews. But through it all, there has always remained a Jewish presence in the land of Israel and in their ancestral capital, Jerusalem. The Jewish people, no matter the conditions, usually under the yoke of a foreign power, have always kept their homeland close at heart. The ending words of Israel's national anthem, Hatikva, the hope, sum it up nicely. The hope of 2,000 years to live as a free people in our own land, the land of Zion and Jerusalem. And on May 14th, 1948, after their entire race was nearly wiped off the face of the earth, they finally had their independence, a state in their beloved homeland. The very next day, beginning with the Palestinian Arabs, the whole of the Arab Middle East attacked them. Armies from Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and a force sent by Saudi Arabia fighting under Egyptian command tore into the fledgling state of Israel. But when the dust settled, Israel controlled more territory than under the original UN partition plan. After peace agreements with each Arab state, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank came under Arab control, but Israel was there to stay. Ever since then, including through two more wars in 1967 and 1973, where Arab nations tried to destroy the Jewish state again, the Arabs have refused to acknowledge Israel's right to even exist. But Israel does exist. It has a right to exist, and it must exist. And we, as the leaders of the free world, must help ensure that Israel continues to exist and to thrive. They are the only functioning democracy in the region, our only real ally in that part of the world. And their intelligence gathering operation is one of the most, if not the most, effective in the world. We will never know the true extent of cooperation between our CIA, NSA, and military intelligence and their Mossad, but we know that the cooperation is extensive. There are many examples, and we always learn about them well after the fact. In 2014, for example, U.S. diplomats reported that Israel assisted the U.S. against ISIS by providing lists of Westerners who joined ISIS. They also provided vital intelligence from their drones flying over ISIS territory. The information was used to carry out airstrikes and plan attacks on the Islamic State. In 2017, we learned that Israeli agents penetrated a bomb-making cell in Syria. They shared that ISIS had learned to make explosives resembling laptop computer batteries, which could pass through airport security undetected. The intelligence prompted the United States to ban many electronic devices on flights from 10 airports in Muslim countries to the United States and the UK. But the most well-known example is the help Israel gave us during the operation to kill Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Iranian National Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force, the heart of Iran's support for terror. More than a year after the successful operation, we learned that Israel shared 3 cell phone numbers used by Soleimani hours before American drones fired missiles at the Iranian general and his entourage. The Israelis passed Soleimani's numbers to the Americans, who traced Soleimani to Baghdad. The rest is history. One of Iran's most feared terror commanders was no more. Without Israeli intelligence, the terrorists and their supporters would have a much stronger hand to play against the West. Our intelligence would have a much harder time getting a handle on what the terrorists are planning, and more Americans would be dead because of it. And remember, the terrorists and Wahhabis and the Islamic extremists, they have made their aims clear. And those statistic goals are not restricted to Israel and the Middle East. We are targets as well. 9/11 would only be the beginning if Hamas, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Iran, and the like had their way. In short, our own national security is greatly enhanced with Israel as our ally in the Middle East. Just this week, the FBI director gave testimony about the threat of terror in the homeland. Let's watch.
But the ongoing war in the Middle East has raised the threat of an attack against Americans in the United States to a whole nother level. Since the horrific terrorist attacks committed by Hamas against innocent people in Israel a few weeks ago, we've been working around the clock to support our partners there and to protect Americans here at home. We assess that the actions of Hamas and its allies will serve as an inspiration, the likes of which we haven't seen since ISIS launched its so-called caliphate several years ago. In just the past few weeks, multiple foreign terrorist organizations have called for attacks against Americans and the West. Al-Qaeda issued its most specific call to attack the United States in the last 5 years. ISIS urged its followers to target Jewish communities in the United States and Europe.
So it looks like the war against Hamas has already drawn us into it. We are being specifically targeted. Let's watch just a bit more.
As the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, the Iranians, for instance, have directly or by hiring criminals mounted assassination attempts against dissidents and high-ranking current and former U.S. government officials, including right here on American soil.
Our national security needs a strong Israel more now than ever before. But we need Israel for more than just national security. They are a balance to the autocratic, unfree, and plainly cruel governments of the Middle East as well. Darkness grows when it is unchallenged, and the existence of a democratically elected government, which protects free speech and allows a free media, checks its autocratic neighbors' slide into darkness. This is something that free nations do. They lift up the unfree around them, acting as a beacon of hope. Those living under harsh dictatorships or absolute monarchs have something to yearn for, something they can see with their own eyes when a free nation is nearby. Freedom is contagious. It stands in stark contrast to what nearly 500 million Muslims in the Middle East live under. And while that freedom and the rights it implies doesn't just roll across the region, ousting dictators overnight, it does give those dictators something to worry about. And this is key. It provides a base level of humaneness from which dictators stray too far at their own peril. This likely serves to dampen the fires of Islamic extremism to some extent, along with the fact that Israel's military is more powerful than any in the region by far. If Israel were to disappear, replaced by some Palestinian-type theocracy, the level of oppression throughout the Middle East would rise exponentially. People in Gaza and the West Bank go to Israel. People from Jordan and Syria travel to Israel. They see with their own eyes the freedom the Israelis enjoy, and they are right next door. Whether they know it or not, that reality raises their expectations when it comes to how they are treated by their own governments. And don't forget that 21% of Israel's population is Arab, and those Arabs in Israel enjoy all the freedoms and protections of human rights afforded by the Israeli democracy. Now, just here's a question for you. How many Jews live in Gaza? 0. Not 1. Think about that. But back to Israel's military for a moment. Having a strong allied military in the world's most important shatter belt is essential. It is a deterrent in and of itself, a strong check against Islamist extremism. And in the same way that the Iraq and Afghanistan wars soaked up nearly all the terrorist resources and manpower, Israel occupies the attention of those that would see the United States harmed. Without Israel, the full fury of Islamic extremism would fall squarely on the United States, the so-called Great Satan. That alone is reason enough for the United States to fully and unequivocally and forever support Israel. And then, of course, there is a religious aspect to all of this. Whether Democrats like it or not, the United States is a Judeo-Christian nation. The Bible matters. Listen to Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 6 and 7. It says, "For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his own possession out of all the peoples that are on the face of the earth. It was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love upon you and chose you, for you were the fewest of the peoples." The Israelites are God's chosen people. This doesn't mean they are better than others. Christians believe that God uses Israelites to set an example. They are a people with whom God has formed a covenant, and they are also the vehicle through which Jesus came into the world to save all humanity from their sins. And the Jews are the descendants of the Israelites. God actually holds them to a higher standard, as it sometimes seems. In Luke chapter 12, verse 48, it is written, quote, "Everyone to whom much was given, of him much will be required, and from him to whom they entrusted much, they will demand the more." Much has definitely been demanded of the Jews over their history. There's no denying that. If we are to hold true to Christianity and to God, we must stand by Israel. Christians must stand by Israel. But all we get are half measures, platitudes, and empty actions from Biden. We hear Biden's people go on about how ISIS and Hamas are not the same thing and do not pose the same threat. We hear that Israel must put the safety of Gazan civilians above the safety of its own people for some reason. We hear that the lone two-plane U.S. airstrike on an Iranian proxy terror group is in no way related to the terror attack on Israel. And we hear Vice President Kamala Harris say this week that we have absolutely no intention, nor do we have any plans to send combat troops into Israel or Gaza, period. Well, Biden says that we are standing by Israel, but we most certainly are not. Israel has made it clear that they see this war as a fight for their very existence. Netanyahu went even further on Monday. He said that Israel is fighting Hamas on behalf of the West. He said, quote, "We've made it clear that we are not only fighting our war, but also their war, because if Hamas is not defeated, then the axis of evil will win." And he is absolutely, completely, 100% correct. It doesn't matter whether Hamas, ISIS, or Iran have the same exact goals. They don't. But in the larger picture, they all have the same end state in mind. They want to live in a world free of Israeli and Western influence. They want all of us gone. They are an axis of evil, supportive of each other in the larger picture, even if they disagree on the tactics and the details. This evil that spread over Israel on October 7th is not an isolated incident. It is not something we can deal with as just a single one-off issue. It is part of a much larger problem, a much larger movement that would like to see Israel and the West turn to ash. Because Israel is a part of the West and a part of the free world. In fact, Israel is where the free world began. Before Rome, before Athens, there was Jerusalem. The Islamic Caliphate that all these Islamic extremist groups strive for has no place for freedom. In fact, freedom is the very antithesis of it. The autocratic theocracy they covet cannot exist in the presence of real freedom and respect for individual liberty. There is no room for compromise on this one. Either we win or they do. If we win, they will continue to exist and thrive. We believe, and that's because we believe that all men are created in the image of the Creator. But if they win, well, we have just seen what that means for us. And they will not stop with Israel. The United States is next once they have gathered enough strength to match us. Iran and the terrorists they support have made that very, very, very clear. And we cannot rely on the Sunni-Shia rivalry to save the United States or the West should it come to that. Saudi Arabia and Iran compete and are not friends, but they are both full of Islamic extremists of different stripes. The Saudis play along with us now because they must. We are orders of magnitude stronger than they are. How would things change if the playing field was level? I think we all know the answer to that. All we must do is look at their massive support for Wahhabism, the tenets of which drive and excuse terror the world over. So whenever the threat of Islamist extremism rises, we must beat it down as fast and forcibly as we can. Netanyahu is right. This is our war too. Israel is the front line, and it is a war of good versus evil. They are fighting for their survival, and we must finally enter the fray both for their sake and ours. If Biden doesn't want to send in U.S. ground troops, there are other ways of helping Israel directly. But if this isn't a time to use at least some U.S. ground forces, I don't know what is. The most important ally we have in the world's most important chatter zone is fighting for its life. At the very least, we could send some troops to secure some of Israel's cities to deter the escalation that Biden seems so worried about, but is making more likely with his current plan of no action. At a minimum, we should be launching air and missile strikes on Hamas and every Iranian proxy terror group we can find, and we need to take out Iran's nuclear program now. Israel is too important to leave to fend for itself, and simply not interfering with Israeli planning and operations does not count as help. Even if we think the Israelis can handle this, that they will win a great victory, and I think they will, the U.S. should still take very visible action to fight right alongside Israel. The world needs to know that our commitment to Israel is ironclad, and that we will not tolerate anyone trying to push them into the sea. An attack on Israel should be seen as an attack on the United States. And then there is the issue of 33 dead Americans and the American hostages as well. We should take severe action against Hamas for that alone. So we have two very compelling reasons to help Israel destroy Hamas. Not doing so sends a dangerous message, the message that the United States will not respond if you kill Americans or take Americans hostage. That message emboldens and strengthens the axis of evil that we would see wants to see us destroyed. The time has come for President Biden to use the power of the United States military to destroy Hamas alongside the Israeli efforts to do that. We cannot let them go this alone. We need a strong and vibrant Israel standing as a beacon of light in the darkness of the Middle East. We need to deal those who would destroy Israel a crushing blow. And we need to ensure that the entire world knows we will not tolerate this or any other axis of evil trying to destroy freedom while spreading its evil tyranny. And we must make darn sure that the entire planet knows you will pay a heavy, crushing price for killing Americans or taking Americans hostage. It's time to do your job, President Biden. It's time to actually be the leader of the free world. Stop pretending, stop vacillating, stop worrying about your political base, stop showing weakness, and lead. Well, that's all for today's show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to tune in next time, and be sure to subscribe to our channels on YouTube and Rumble, like the video, leave a comment. Doing all those things helps us tremendously. And remember one more thing, the CCP must be destroyed.